Hello and welcome to your Delphi for Linux Boot Camp. My name is Craig Chapman. I'm a software consultant for Embarcadero Technologies, and on the screen right now you can see my email address and my Twitter handle, and also a link to my blog and the blog post which accompanies this session. Any source code produced in this session will be available at that blog post. So let's take a look at what we'll be covering today. I'm going to get started by installing Oracle's VirtualBox, which will allow us to run a Linux server inside our Windows development machine. There are certain hardware and software requirements for that, which I'll cover shortly, but we will then look at how to install an Ubuntu server into the VirtualBox software. The minimum version of Ubuntu supported by Rad Studio Delphi is Ubuntu Server 16.04. You could also opt to use the Red Hat Linux, and a link to how to configure a Red Hat server is included on the blog post which accompanies this session. We'll take a look at how to deploy the PA server to that Linux machine, and then how to use the PA server to deploy a Hello World application, which will take a look at some ideas of how we can go about debugging that application as well. We're then going to look at configuring Apache 2, the web server, and deploy into that a web broker module which we'll write using Delphi. Finally, we'll add FireDAC support to that web broker module, giving us the ability to build either HTML-based web pages or JSON-based endpoints. Before we get started with this, let's hand over to Jim McKeith, who's going to tell us a little bit about the history of the various Linux flavors and families, and also tell us about a very special book offer from O'Reilly Publications.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about Linux families. Now, this is a Linux family tree of all the distributions, starting when they start on the left to when they're on the right. So the lines you see on the right are the ones that are still active. And all these show inheritance and which ones are based on what and how they're influenced and so on. When became available, when they ended becoming available, etc. The main thing I want you to see is there's a lot of Linux distributions. So before you ask, does this Delphi support Linux distribution X? Well, that's a good question. So let's break this down into something I think hopefully will be a lot more useful for you. On that chart, you would have noticed that two of the roots are Debian and Slackware. These are two unique distributions that are the point of origin of most of the other Linux distributions. They're either based on these or derived from these or heavily influenced by these. Now, on the Debian side, the current largest distribution in the Debian family is Ubuntu. Ubuntu's got a huge following, very big, very popular, and like I said, it's the largest distribution on the Debian side. There's actually now derivatives of Ubuntu. On the Slackware side, a new variation showed up called Red Hat. Red Hat is RPM based. So RPM it came out before Slackware, but then kind of merged with Slackware. And so it's heavily influenced by Slackware, not merged by Slackware, but it's heavily influenced by Slackware. And Red Hat is the big player on this side here within Slackware space. Now, on the chart, if you were to look at it, Red Hat actually has its own node starting before it's influenced by Slackware, but later on shows that it does receive a heavy influence from Slackware. Now, within Red Hat space, we have Fedora and SUSE. Fedora is the free version of Red Hat, if you will, although you can get Red Hat for free as well, but Fedora is kind of their community edition, and then SUSE is another very large distribution. Now, our officially supported versions are Ubuntu and Red Hat, which are the two largest players on each side of this Debian Slackware fence, if you will. Now, we had a MVP that also tried with Slackware and reported good luck. So our expectation is that because we are supporting Ubuntu and Red Hat, you're going to be able to work with most compatible distributions that work with either Red Hat or Ubuntu. Now, we're officially testing and officially supporting Red Hat and Ubuntu, so your mileage may vary when it comes to more niche distributions within those families. Now, also, I'm going to point out something interesting that just happened recently, is Microsoft Windows 10 entered the Ubuntu space. Now, this doesn't mean that it's based on Ubuntu or anything like that, but it actually can run Ubuntu as I think they call it Windows Linux Services. And so You can install a really lightweight version of Ubuntu within there, and there are some things that work and some things that don't work. It's still very early and very beta, but from what I've seen, you can't run PA Server on the Windows services because it doesn't have an IP address. It's really weird. It's not a virtual machine, okay, but it is running Linux, Ubuntu on Windows. And so it's like an application running on Windows. So if you try to, for example, bind to an IP address, if that IP address is used in the Windows side, you can't bind to it on the Ubuntu side because it is running on that machine. It's the same machine. It's not a virtual machine. So you have the same file system. It's really kind of weird. So there's a few things I noticed in experimenting with it that don't work, and looking online, a lot of people are like having the same issues. And I tried running PA Server. It didn't work. That may change by release. It may change tomorrow. It may not work at all because, like I said, this is very beta. But you can run some of your apps you make with Delphi on the Ubuntu services for Windows. So that's something to keep in mind. You could come up with a system, for example, where you connect to a Linux virtual machine, build that SDK, keep that SDK offline, and then just build and then manually deploy to Ubuntu services instead of needing to connect to a virtual machine for testing purposes. That might work. So, and again, that's one of those things your mileage may vary, especially because of the fact that the Ubuntu services for Windows is very beta. Okay, and is changing very frequently. There's things I got working that, looking online, other people said didn't work because it was a beta. Hopefully it'll work in the future. So apparently that changed to the better. So you're no doubt familiar with O'Reilly. They're one of my favorite technical book publishers, and we're working with them. They've provided this free Linux survival guide for each of you on this webinar, this boot camp today. This is 10 tips to Linux survival, essentials for navigating the bash jungle. Now, there's a ton of great resources just through Google online. If you Google what you're trying to do, that'll help you out. But I've found that frequently it's very useful to have some sort of starting point to get you where you need to go. So that's what this is here. And you can get your free copy if you go to embt.co/free Linux guide. You can download your free ebook. It's 10 easy steps to Linux survival. And hopefully you'll find it very useful, covering things like how to connect to it through OpenSSH or PuTTY, navigating around bash, then using grep and other things like that. So it kind of starts out with some of the fundamentals and then gets a little more advanced. For example, starting, stopping, and killing services, which is useful, and even where to go to get additional help when you find that you've exhausted your resources via the book or Google searches. So definitely check that out. Take advantage of this special offer here there at Free Linux Guide at embt.co/free Linux Guide.
So in order to get started writing software for Linux, the first thing we'll need, of course, is a computer running the Linux operating system. And you could choose to use real hardware for this. Perhaps you have a spare machine on your network that you can use, but I would prefer, for convenience, to use a virtual machine. Now, a virtual machine is like a simulated computer running on my development desktop. So I have a Windows development desktop, which we'll call the host, and I'll have a Linux virtual computer running inside of that, which we'll call the guest, a Linux guest. Now, in order to run a virtual machine, I'm going to need virtualization software, and I'll be using Oracle VirtualBox. But you're also going to need certain hardware requirements. So in your processor, you'll need virtualization technology. If you're running Intel, that means having Intel VT, virtualization technology. Or if you're running AMD hardware, you'll want AMD-V for AMD's virtualization. You'll also need to make sure that virtualization is enabled in your system BIOS. And once you've done that, you'll also need sufficient disk space for the guest operating system. So make sure that you have at least, I would say, 40 to 60 gigabytes to spare on your hard disk. And you'll also need sufficient RAM. Now, a Linux machine is going to require around 4 gigabytes of RAM. I think that's actually the minimum for most modern Linux operating systems. And you'll also need sufficient RAM on top of that for running your host operating system. So I would say you're probably going to need a minimum of 8 GB of RAM installed in your machine. Assuming you have all of that, go ahead and download VirtualBox from virtualbox.org. So I'm going to click on the big download button, and I'm going to select Windows hosts. I want to run virtual machines on my Windows desktop. And while I'm here, I also need to get this VirtualBox extension pack. So this is just going to add additional support for various hardware devices, such as USB 2 and 3 devices. Now, while that's downloading, Oracle's VirtualBox is actually incompatible with a virtualization feature of Microsoft's Windows. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Windows Features. Oops. And I want to make sure that Hyper-V is disabled. So this is some built-in virtualization management technology in the Windows operating system, and it's incompatible with certain features of Oracle's VirtualBox, so make sure that that's disabled. Now, if you do have to turn this off, you'll need to restart your Windows PC for it to take effect. Okay, so we have the VirtualBox software downloaded. Once we have our virtual machine running, we're going to need a way to transfer files to it. And the simplest solution I found is to use Winscp. So almost every Linux distribution out of the box supports an SSH service, and Winscp takes advantage of that to enable you to transfer files to the Linux machine. So head on over to winscp.net. Now, this website very often has a lot of ads on it, and a lot of those ads look like download buttons. And you want to be very careful not to download the wrong thing or click on the wrong thing. So we're going to click on the download link here at the top. And ignoring any advertisements, we want to click on this installation package. And if the installation doesn't begin automatically, which it has for me, then you want to click on this direct download link. Okay, so we have Winscp. We'll take a look at that in a moment. We're also going to need a Linux operating system to install. So I'm going to head on over to ubuntu.com. I'm going to download and install Ubuntu today. And I'm going to go to download, and I'm going to select the server edition. Now, you could use desktop, possibly one of the other editions, but Linux server is going to be a headless. It doesn't have a GUI system. It's just going to be a plain command line based server. And this is what you're most likely to encounter if you lease hosted servers online. So I'm going to go ahead and download their server edition. Now, we've got a couple of options here. You will need at least 1604 for the version number, which is good. And I'm going to go ahead and download the LTS version. Now, what this means is if you actually get support from Canonical, the makers of Ubuntu, then the version of the operating system that they support is their LTS, or long-term support version. So you want to be downloading the LTS if you plan to use commercial support from Canonical. Click on download and wait for a moment for the download to begin. Okay, I'll see you when this is finished. Okay, so with all of the downloading completed, let's go ahead and start installing VirtualBox. I'm going to go ahead and click Next on the Welcome page, and I'm going to select the components that I want to install, in my case, everything. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Yes, I want a shortcut created and the file associations to be registered, so I'll click Next. And then I get this warning. And what this warning is telling us is during the installation of VirtualBox, several drivers are going to be installed, including the driver for the network interfaces. If you're using your network for anything else at this point, that connection will be interrupted. So you need to finish whatever you're doing before you click on Yes to proceed with this installation. Now, as those drivers are installed on the system, these dialog boxes are going to pop up. Now, they're not going to pop up on my system because I have installed VirtualBox before, and when I did, I checked this box that says Always Trust Software from Oracle Corporation. So automatically my system is simply going to accept these drivers and install them. I'm not going to get these dialogs. But if you get these dialog boxes, you want to go ahead and click on Install, and if you check this box, then the dialogues will stop coming and it'll simply install them automatically. Okay, so assuming you've finished everything you're doing with your networking, click on yes and the install button. Okay, so Oracle Box installation is now complete. I click on finish and the Oracle Box UI is going to pop up. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm going to come back to the downloads folder and pick out the extension pack, and when I double click the extension pack it will reopen Oracle VirtualBox and it'll present you with this dialog box. Yours ought to say install to install the extension pack. Because I've had it installed previously, I'm going to reinstall. The license agreement, I need to scroll down to the bottom and then the agree button is enabled, so I agree. And now the extension pack is installed. So now we're ready to begin setting up our Linux environment. So I'll go ahead and click on new and I'll type Ubuntu for the machine name, and automatically you can see that VirtualBox has selected Linux and it's 64-bit Linux. Now if you don't have 64-bit Linux in this list, it's quite probable that you don't have the virtualization technology of your processor enabled. So you may need to restart at this point, go into your BIOS settings and make sure that the virtualization technology is enabled so that you have the 64-bit options. You do need a 64-bit Ubuntu installation because Rad Studio only supports 64-bit Linux at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and click on next. And now I need to decide how much memory I'm going to give to my virtual machine. And you'll remember that most modern Linux installations require around 4 gigabytes, so I'm going to put 4096 megabytes and click on next. Now we're being asked if we'd like to create a hard disk for our virtual machine. Now this hard disk is actually just a file on disk, but it simulates a hard disk for the virtual machine. So I'm going to go ahead and create one now because we do need a disk to install Linux onto. And then I get to choose what type of hard disk file I want. Now, if you plan on sharing your virtual machines with other virtualization software, you could choose, for example, VMDK, which works with Parallels. Or you could use a VHD, I don't know which one that works with. But the VDI is the VirtualBox default format, and it's actually the most flexible if you plan to stick with VirtualBox. So that's what I'm going to select. Now we need to decide if the image that we create for our hard disk is going to be dynamically allocated or fixed in size. If it's fixed in size, then you'll allocate a specific amount of your hard disk to be used for your virtual machine. Dynamic, on the other hand, will only use the amount required. So I'm going to go ahead and select dynamic so that the file is only as big as it needs to be. Now I have to decide how big I want to allow that file to grow to. If I'd select fixed size before, then I could specify exactly how big I want the hard disk image to be. Because I selected dynamic, I'm actually selecting how large it can become at its maximum. So I can put a relatively large number in here. I'm going to put 100 gigabytes, knowing that we're not likely to ever reach 100 gigabytes with our virtual machine, but that means that there's plenty of allowance in the file size. Go ahead and click on create, and the image has been created for us, and we now have this Ubuntu virtual machine. So this actually is a simulated virtual machine at this point. We could start this up and it would do everything a computer would normally do when there isn't an operating system installed on it. But we want to install Ubuntu. Before we do that, we need to set some settings up. So the first setting is going to be under the storage section here. I want to insert the Ubuntu disk. So under the IDE controller, I'm going to select this little CD icon. This is our CD drive. And I'm going to go ahead and click this little drop down and then browse to my downloads folder where we downloaded the Ubuntu ISO image. So we're effectively inserting this disk into the CD drive by doing that. We also need to change some network settings. So there are several options for how your virtual machine should interface with the network card on your computer. We want to be able to access the virtual machine from the host machine, so we need some kind of virtual network between the two. So what I'm going to select here is the bridged adapter. Now the bridged adapter is going to allow me to bridge the virtual network with the host network. I'm selecting the Qualcomm here. Yours will be different. This is the networking device installed in my system, and it's the wireless network driver because I'm connected to a wireless network. So what this means is the virtual machine, when we bridge these adapters, will be able to connect through what is effectively my Wi-Fi network, but it will be presented on the virtual machine as this card, the adapter, which is actually not a wireless adapter. This is a fixed adapter. So the simulated network is going to be a fixed adapter, an Ethernet adapter, and it's actually bridged to my wireless so that we can get internet access from the virtual machine. But I don't want to use this Intel Pro system here. What I actually want to use is this parallelized or parallel virtualized network. Now, this is actually a software driver which is going to allow the guest operating system to host services. And we do need that because we're going to deploy the PA server, and we want to be able to connect to that PA server from the host. So that's our network settings. Feel free to look at some of the other settings. You can set, for example, how many processor cores you want to dedicate to your virtual machine. You can decide whether or not you have acceleration using the virtual VT technology that we discussed. So you can decide how you want the machine set up, but I'm going to leave everything else as default. That should be sufficient. So we've inserted the Ubuntu install disk. Let's go ahead and hit start to start this Ubuntu machine up. Now, one of the things you'll see here is you have auto capture keyboard option turned on. This will cause the virtual machine to automatically capture the keyboard. And the same warning is going to pop up about the mouse. And what this means is if I click within the virtual machine window, the virtual machine captures my mouse. I'm no longer able to move my mouse on the guest operating system. We can actually fix this with some VirtualBox add-ons later. But what I'm going to do for right now is press the special hotkey, which is the control key on the right-hand side of your keyboard. This key frees your mouse pointer back up, so we come back to the host machine. Okay, back on the guest machine, let's go ahead and hit enter to select English as the installation language. And then we're going to select from this menu here using the arrow keys, install Ubuntu server, and press enter to select that. So now I'm being asked which language do we want to use for the virtual machine. Again, I'm going to select English. And then we're being asked approximately where in the world we are. Well, I'm in the United States, so I'm going to select that option. Now the installer is going to try to automatically detect which type of keyboard is connected. I'm going to go ahead and tell it yes, let's do that. Please press one of these keys. Let's press Y, W. We don't have one of those keys, nor one of those. Okay, so based on the keys, it's picked up as US International. Okay, so at this point I'm being asked what I'd like to name the Ubuntu machine. I'm going to leave that as Ubuntu. This is actually the host name, so on my network, this machine should appear as Ubuntu. Now we want to enter the full name for the user, so that's going to be my full name. And a username. Now this is a username for an account which is effectively a non-administrative account. So I'm going to leave the name of Craig and continue. I need to give Craig a password. And continue. And confirm that password. Okay, I'm not going to encrypt my home directory on this Linux server. Basically, the home directory is the user account directory. I'm not going to encrypt it because encryption might get in the way if I ever have to do recovery of files from this system. So I'm going to leave that as a no, but you make your own choice. It won't affect the rest of this session. Okay, so the system has determined that I am in the same time zone as Chicago, which is correct, so I'll hit yes. And now we're being asked how we'd like to set up the hard disk. I'm going to go ahead and select guided use entire disk. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow the Ubuntu installer to look at the virtual disk that we created and decide to use all of it in whatever way it chooses. So it'll partition it however it likes. So I'm going to go ahead and hit return on that. And then we have to select a disk. Well, there's only one disk inserted, and that's the 100 gigabyte disk that we created. And now we're being asked for a confirmation. So let's go ahead and write these changes. And we're being asked if our network uses a HTTP proxy. Well, mine does not, so I'm going to leave that blank. And now we're being asked which software packages that we'd like to install on the system. I'm going to go ahead and install the LAMP server, that's Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, because I know that I have uses for those outside of this session. But you should go ahead and install that too, because we are going to be using the Apache web server. We want the standard system utilities, and we also want to turn on the OpenSSH server. This is going to allow us to connect to the server from the host machine and transfer files to it. So we're going to want to do that. Now, because I decided to install LAMP, that's also installing the MySQL database, and it wants a password for the root user of that database. So I'm going to go ahead and put a password in here. And no doubt it will ask me to confirm that. And finally, we're being asked if we'd like to install the Grub bootloader. This is the boot record that makes booting Linux possible, so we do need that. And now we're being told that the installation is complete. So when we hit continue, the Ubuntu installer is actually going to eject the virtual CD, which is perfect. We don't want the CD in any longer. We've done installing. And the machine is restarted and is booting into Ubuntu server. Okay, so I'm now at the login prompt, and you'll remember during installation I created a user named Craig, and I gave that a password. And as I explained, this is a non-administrative user. However, the Ubuntu installer has actually added Craig to the sudoers list, which is a list of users that are able to use the instruction sudo. This is short for super user do. So this basically allows me to elevate my privileges to root or administrator. So I'm going to go ahead and say sudo, and I'm going to enter the instruction passwd, short for password. And what this is going to let me do is set the root password, so set the administrative password for this system. And first I need to give the password for Craig. And now I need to give a new password for the root user. So I'm going to go ahead and set one. And now that that password is set, I can use the instruction su, or super user. And what that's going to do is allow me to actually elevate my privileges for the entire session. So it's going to ask for the root password, which I just set. And I'm now root. You can see at the command prompt there, I'm the root user. This means that I have the privilege to do anything I want on this system. Now, in general, you want to be logged in as root as little as possible and use sudo for everything. But typing sudo for every instruction can be tedious, and we still have some setup to do. So I'm going to enter su and become the root user, and now we can enter the additional setup commands. The first of those commands is going to be to update the system. So I'm going to use a command called apt-get. So the package manager for Ubuntu is called aptitude, and apt-get is a command line instruction for the aptitude package manager. And I'm going to tell it to update. Now what that's going to do is it's going to go off to the Ubuntu web servers, and it's going to find out which packages are available for this version of Ubuntu. So at this point in the recording, the instruction took far too long to complete, maybe because of slow network on my end, or maybe because of slow networking at the Ubuntu servers. So I took a break and I came back and restarted and reissued the apt-get update command, and so now we're back at the end of that command. Just a heads up, it can take a little while to download the updates from Ubuntu, particularly at peak times. And we're not yet done, because what apt-get update has done is download the catalog of packages for us. We now want to install any updates which have been performed on the packages that we have installed since the installation CD was built. So that can be done with the instruction apt-get upgrade. So any packages that have seen updates since the installation CD was made, we'll now download those packages and install them. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Y to confirm. And now I'm going to go away for another break while I wait for Ubuntu to download and install its packages. So I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so all of those packages have been downloaded and updated. And now what we need to do is add a few more packages if they're not already installed, which are the dependencies required by the PA server. So I'm going to do apt-get install to install packages, and then we'll list the packages we need. So from the Embarcadero documentation, I can see that we need Joe, wget, p7 zip full, curl, build essentials, or essential rather, zlib, I think that's 1g dev. We also need libcurl, which is number 4 -gnutills-dev. So those are the packages that PA server depends on for deploying and debugging. And it looks like I typed one of them wrong, libcurl 4 gnutills. It's because it's gnutills-dev. Let's try that again. Okay, and now we're ready to install them. So yes, and a little more waiting. Okay, so now that our dependencies are installed, I'm going to go ahead and do a restart on the Ubuntu server just to make sure that all of the settings have taken. So we'll do a shutdown, -r for restart 0, and we'll let Ubuntu restart. Okay, and again I'm going to log in as the non-administrative user, and everything seems to be in order, so let's go ahead and deploy our PA server to this. The first thing we need to do is install the Winscp software that we downloaded earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and run through the installer. I'm going to select all of the default options, so I'll accept the license agreement. I'm going to go next, next, install. And I don't need the getting started page. Let's launch it. And we're now at the login screen for Winscp. So what we need to do is provide the IP address of our Ubuntu server. And we can get that by typing ifconfig at the command line. And that's going to list the network cards in the server. And one of them, as you can see here, is, let me see if I can highlight it. Okay, it's 192.168.0.15. So that's the IP address of this server on my network. So let's go ahead and put that in here, 192.168.0.15. And I'm not going to fill any of the other details in. I'll go ahead and save this just in case we need it again. And hit login. Okay, so it's now asking me to accept this security certificate from the server. I'll tell it yes. And then the username, again, the non-administrative account, so Craig, and the password. And we're now logged into our Ubuntu server. So what we have here is a directory listing on the left-hand side, which is my host machine, and a directory listing on the right-hand side, which is under Home Craig, the home directory of my user account on the Ubuntu server. So on my host machine, I'm going to navigate to Program Files, Embarcadero, Studio, and in this case I'm going for 19, so this will be for Berlin 10.2. And then within here we have a directory called PA Server, and if we take a look in this directory we can see Linux PA Server 19 tar.gz. So I'm just going to drag that over into my home directory and let Winscp upload that. Okay, so with the file on the server, we now need to go and uncompress this tar.gzip file. And the instruction to do that is, back in the command line here, we want the tar instruction, which is going to untar the tar file. Tar stands for tape archive. It's historically, as Linux servers would be backed up onto tape, they would be the files would be archived, and our file is compressed. So I'm going to put the options xvf. You can go look at what those mean, but effectively that's saying that we're going to untar and unzip the compressed file. And then I'm going to say I want to unzip the Linux PA server 19.0.tar.gz. And what I did there is I just typed in li and pressed tab, and the Linux command line automatically completes the file name for me. Let's go ahead and do that. And if I type the ls instruction, which is list, we can actually see the PA server directory there. So we have the file, which is in red, and it's a little hard to see in blue there, but that's the PA server -19.0 directory. So if I type ls-lart, that will show me all of the file permissions for each of the files in the directory. I'm going to issue the cd, change directory command, and I'm going to type in PA and press tab to select PA server 19. So I'm now in the PA server directory, and again I'm going to do an ls to list the directory, and we can see there in green the PA server executable. So what we need to do is we want to start that executable, which we can do by pressing /PA server. So what's that? That's basically telling the system to do is to look in the current directory, that's the dot, and then the / for the directory separator and PA server. And this is just a shorthand for running an executable on the Linux command line. So I'll go ahead and run that, and the PA server is asking me if I want to set a password. Well, I don't. I'm just going to leave that blank. And now I'm at the PA server's command terminal. So if I type help, I can see a list of instructions that we can execute on this server, and one of the useful ones here is the I instruction, which is going to print our IP address. That's the IP address that the server is running on. So let's go ahead and open up Rad Studio or Delphi if that's what you have. Okay, and with that open, I'm going to go ahead and do a file new other. And because we can't create graphical applications with the Linux support in Delphi yet, what we're going to do instead is create a console application. So I'm going to select console application and click OK. And now in the target platforms area under the project manager, I'm going to right click on target platforms and select add platform. And then I'm going to select 64-bit Linux from the drop down and click OK. And now I'm going to try and deploy this application, but before I do, let's make it print something to the screen. So we'll put a writeline. Hello, cruel world. So that's going to get written to our screen when we run the program. So now if I try to deploy this by hitting the Run with Debugging option, immediately I get the Create a Configuration Profile window. And that's because I haven't yet connected my IDE to the server. So the profile name I'm going to use here is Ubuntu VM. And I need to give it the IP address, which, if you'll remember, was 192.168.0.15, leaving this on the default port, and we didn't set a password when we started the server. So I'll hit test connection, and the test has succeeded, finish. Now what's going to happen is all of the SDK needs to be imported from the Ubuntu system. So I'm going to leave those settings as their defaults and click OK. And now the IDE is importing all of the header files necessary to access the SDK. Let's give that a moment to complete. And I actually have an error message popped up here. So this is saying the file already exists. I'm going to go ahead and overwrite the existing file, and I'll do that every time it comes up. And now the SDK has been imported and the application is being deployed to our server. And if you blinked, you would have missed it. The application was deployed, it ran, and then exited and returned us back to the IDE. So let's put something in to slow that process down. I'm going to go ahead and put in a readline at the end of my program here. So the program should actually pause when we get to this point. So let's deploy that again with the debugging option on. And down here in the event log, any moment now, there it is. Hello Cruel World has appeared because that's what's been output on our terminal, and the program's actually waiting for us to press a key. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this from running, and we'll go and take another look back on the server. So if I quit out of the PA server and do a list, come up one directory, cd space ... so that's change directory, and ... represents the upper directory. So we come back up into my home directory, do another list. We can see, if you look carefully there, let's list these. There's actually 3 different things in this directory that are not hidden. One of them is PA server -19.0, that's the directory that we were just in and running the PA server from. Another is a PA server directory which has been created, and we still have the tar file laying around there. So I'm going to go ahead and type in rm lin tab to complete the Linux PA server tar file name, and press return, and that's going to remove the tar file. So now we just have the 2 directories. I'm going to step into the new PA server directory and do another list. It's very difficult to see in the blue, I know, but what that actually says there is scratch dir. So we actually have a scratch directory that's been created by our PA server. So again, if I change directory into the scratch dir and do a list, what do we have? Craig Chapman Ubuntu VM. So that's a directory that's been created based on my Windows username and the profile name by which Rad Studio connected to the Linux server. So I'm going to change into that directory and do another list, and I have project 1. That's the name of my project. So I'm going to change into project 1 and do another list, and there I actually have the project 1 executable. So again, to execute an executable on Linux, we need to do the // and then I'm going to type in the name project 1 and press enter. And you can see hello crawl world, enter again, and the program exits. So that's actually the binary program having been built and deployed. Okay, so we're now at the point that we can start doing some more interesting development work with the Linux server. But before we do, I'd like to show you one more feature of the Oracle VirtualBox software, because I think this will come in quite useful. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to issue the shutdown command, and that's -h for halt and 0. So this is shutdown, halt means don't restart, and 0 means do this right away, don't delay. So my Ubuntu server is now going down, and of course Winscp is complaining because it's no longer connected. So let's get rid of that, and let's close the IDE. I don't want to save that project. And if we take a look back in the VirtualBox Manager, now that the Ubuntu server is powered off, there's something very useful we can do here. I'm going to right click on the Ubuntu server, and I'm going to select clone. I'm then going to give this, let's leave the name as it is, Ubuntu clone, and click next. I'm going to select a full clone, so that's going to clone everything, the machine settings and the image file, and click on clone. Now this is going to take some time to complete, but effectively what this is doing, it's making a complete copy of our Ubuntu server in its current state. So if we then did something to mess up the configuration on our Ubuntu server, we would be able to very easily revert back to the previous just by going to the clone and making a copy of that again. So I'm going to let that complete, and actually it looks like it's going to be relatively quick. I'm going to take you to where I store my virtual machines now, and you can see here that we have the Ubuntu machine and the clone being built right here. Now, one of the interesting things that you can do with a clone, or even with the original image, is you can take these files and you can go back them up, maybe send them out onto an external USB drive or something, and at a future time you can re-import this machine back into VirtualBox. So you can set up the machine how you want it to be and make an absolute perfect backup copy of the machine in that current state. Very, very useful if you're going to be working with development machines, because you don't want to have to go through the entire setup process again because you did something wrong with the machine. Maybe you upset the config or what have you. Okay, so we have a working Linux server and we're able to deploy applications to it. Now I want to deploy something a little more interesting than Hello World. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to deploy a web broker module, which is an Apache module, to the Linux server. So we can effectively create an endpoint for a web server. Now before we do that, there is a little trick that I'd like to show you, and I'm just going to go ahead and get logged into my terminal here. There's a little trick that's going to become useful for when we're debugging, and that's the screen command. So the screen command is installed with Ubuntu by default, And if I type in screen-s to create a session, and then I'll give my session a name, say PA server, what it's going to do is create a new terminal session for me. Now this, depending on whether you've run the application before or not, you may get a welcome message when you create a session. But I've come in and I've got a new session, and I'm now going to browse into my PA server 19 directory, and there's my PA server, so I'm going to go ahead and run it. Okay, I don't need a password, and I'm going to print the IP just for the sake of habit. So I have my PA server running, and I'm now going to press Control-Alt-D. And what's happened there is I've been dropped out of the screen session. So the screen session is still running in the background, the PA server is still running, I can still connect to that from my IDE, but I'm back at the command prompt in my Linux shell. If I want to reconnect to the PA server, I can type screen-R for reconnect, and then the name of the session, PA server, and I'm reconnected to that running instance. So this can be really useful when you're debugging, because if I come back out of this, Control-A-D, I can now browse into, say, the PA server directory, into the Scratch directory, and I can come down to my project, and I can actually work with the binary directly here. I could go ahead and launch it and work with it directly on the command line. All the while, the PA server is still running, so my IDE can send a new copy of that binary anytime it needs to. Okay, so let's go ahead and start building a web broker project. The first thing I'm going to do is File, New, and go to Other, and under Delphi Projects Web Broker, I'm going to select Web Server Application. Now I'm going to get some options here. The first is that I should include the ability to support Linux, so I'm going to check that box. And then I'm asked if I want to create an Apache Dynamic Link module, which would be an Apache plugin, or a standalone console application. Now the standalone console application is actually a standalone HTTP server. It's very useful for debugging, and I can easily convert a standalone project into an Apache project later. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go for the standalone first, and then I'll show you later how we can make an Apache module using this. Go ahead and hit next, and I'm on port 8080, which on my local machine is open, so we can use that, and click on finish. So I now have a web broker standalone application. Let's go ahead and save this off. And I'm going to create a new directory on my D drive. Let's call this web broker test. And I'll just save the server const file as it's named. The module file, I'm going to rename this to wmod main, because this will be the main module of my application. And then I'm going to go ahead and save project 1 as, let's say, test, but I'm going to add the letters SA. So that's an indication that this project is for the standalone version. Later, when I create the Apache module, I will remove the SA postfix. But for now, this is test standalone. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got. We've got a server constants file, which we don't really need to modify or work with directly. This is just some text prompts that are sent out from the server when it runs. Obviously, we have our project file, and we have this module, which can be edited visually in the designer. It doesn't actually produce anything visual. This is a non-visual module, but we can drag and drop components onto here as needed. And then, of course, we have access to the source code. Now, a default handler has been generated for us, and the default handler spits out this piece of HTML text. It's just a regular old HTML page with a title, Web Server Application, and with a content, Web Server Application. So I'm going to go ahead and run this in Windows. Just go ahead and run with debugging, and I'm going to type in the start instruction, and that's going to start my local standalone HTTP server running on port 8080. Now I can open up a web browser, and I can browse to localhost on port 8080, and I can see my web page here, Web Server Application. That's the result of our module endpoint. So if I come here and click View Page Source, you'll see this is the exact same HTML that our endpoint is producing. Okay, good. So now let's see that deployed to Linux. So So I'm going to change my target to, or rather add platform, to add the 64-bit Linux and change to that platform. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit run with debugging. And here we're going to see a little problem. So my server is now running and I'm looking at the event log. The server is running up on our Ubuntu machine, but as you saw, I had to type start to actually start the web service running. Well, I can't type start here. I don't have any way of sending input back to the virtual machine. So effectively, my application is stopped at this point. So I've got two options here. The first option is I could go and launch it without debugging here in my Ubuntu terminal. So if I do a list, let's come up a directory. Here within the Scratch directory, I now have a test SA directory, if I can learn to type. So within there, I have the test SA application. And if I run it and type start, now my service is running. So let's just prove that that is running real quick. I'll open up a new browser and we will browse to 192.168.0.15 on port 8080. That's our Linux box. And there is our service running. Unfortunately, we can't debug this because we're running the application outside of the debugger. So let's do this again and see if we can get it inside the debugger. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to come over to the project source and we can see where we enter the instruction to start the server up. We have here start server, else server. So this is under the run server instruction, which is started right down here in the initialization. So effectively this loop, we're doing a while true do, and what we're doing is looping through this time and time again, waiting for same text to match the command that we are issuing to the server. So I'm going to take this start server right here, and I'm going to take a copy of that, and I'm just going to place it up here outside the loop. So if I save that off, what should happen is when we run our server, it will start the server before waiting for instructions from the end user. So that means our server should start up automatically. Let's go ahead and run that out on our Linux box and test it. So I'm still on the Linux target, build and deploy, and sooner or later in the event log we should see the menu pop up. Okay, so now we should be able to browse to that server again, 192.168.0.15 on port 8080, and I can see that my server is there and running from having deployed it. So now I'm able to debug this because I can put breakpoints in. So let's stop this application running, come over to mod main, and we'll put a breakpoint in here where we send back the response. I'm going to deploy it out again. It will of course automatically start up, and I'm going to refresh my browser. So in the part of refreshing my browser, you can see that the IDE now has broken on our breakpoint, and we're able to debug this remotely on the Linux server. So let's go ahead now and convert this from a standalone to a Apache module. And the way that we do that is I'm going to go to the project group and say add new project, and I'm going to select web server application again. This time I'm going to go into Linux, and I'm going to select Apache Dynamic Link Module. Okay, so I need to give my module a name, and it's automatically going to add underscore module for me every time. So I'm just going to name it test. So that's what we're going to be building, and click finish. So now I have libmod test, and before we save this off, we can see that we have a web module already in the project. Well, I don't want that web module in the project because I want to share the web module from my standalone project. So I'm going to remove from project the existing web module, and then I'm going to right click on the project and select add, and I'm going to browse to where I saved my standalone project, and I'm going to add wmod main, which is our main module. Now I can go ahead and save the project off. Mod test is as good a name as any, and it's asking me now if I want to save my project group. Well, yes, I will save that now. So I'll call that group test module. Okay, and we now have a dynamic module here for Apache. It's showing as a DLL because this is currently on the Windows platform, and modules for Apache on Windows are DLL files. But if I go ahead and add the Linux platform and build this, you can see this has become an SO file. Let's build it, and we can go take a look at the binary file. So let's go take a look at web broker, Linux debug, and libmod test is here. So now what we need to do is install libmod test into our Apache server. Before we do that, we need to take a look at a little bit of the Apache server config to understand how that works. So at this point in the recording, I started to have some problems with my Ubuntu server. The IP address of the server keeps changing. Now, I know that this is due to my own home network. The DHCP server is continually reassigning its IP. I'm not sure why that is. It's a new setup on my home network, but I am confident that this isn't down to the configuration of the Ubuntu server, having configured servers this way many times before. There are some points in the video where I have edited to save you watching my confusion when this happens, but these instructions will still follow for you so long as you use the correct IP address. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to find out where on this system we need to place our new module. So I'm going to do that by finding the Apache config. Now, the vast majority of machines, the vast majority of Linux distributions, the configuration files are kept in an etc directory, which is on the root of the drive. So I'm going to change to cd/etc, and then depending on the flavor of Linux you're running, it could be under one of several directory names. I happen to know that on Ubuntu it's under cd Apache 2. Some systems might call this HTTP or HTTPD. It depends on the flavor of Linux, but under Ubuntu the config is in the etc/Apache2 directory. So we'll change in there and take a look at the files that we have. Now, the apache2.conf file is actually the main config file, and on the majority of Linux systems this is what the file will be, apache2.conf or httpd.conf. On Ubuntu, however, they do something a little bit clever. They break down the configuration into multiple files under various enabled and available directories, which you can see listed here. And the reason they do this is to make it easier to manage multiple sites on the server. So you can have configuration or pieces of configuration for each of your sites that are hosted on your web server under the sites available directory, and then issue an instruction at the command line to copy that file into sites enabled, and then restart your Apache server. So this allows you to enable and disable websites at will. And the website that we already have running, the default website, is under sites available. Oh, no, it isn't. It's under sites enabled. And so 000-default.conf is actually the default Apache website, which is running on this machine already since we installed Apache during the installation. So if I go ahead and open up a new browser window here, and I browse to 192.168.0 and 9, we can see the Apache 2 Ubuntu default page here. And this is basically just giving us some information about how you can work with the configuration files on the Apache server. So I'm going to pull this out of the way. That's our default website. And we also have mods enabled. And if we take a look in this directory, we can see a number of pieces of config showing us the modules that are already loaded into Apache. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look first at, let's say, php70.conf. So I'm going to use the Nano Editor, which, if you have a preferred Linux editor, by all means use your own preference, but I like using Nano. And I'm going to nano php7.0.conf and take a look in here. This is not the file I wanted. I actually wanted the other PHP file, which is php7.0.load. Yes, this is what I'm after. So here what we actually have is a load module instruction, and it's telling the Apache server to load php7_module. So that's the name of the module it wants to load, and the directory for that module is /user/lib/apache2/modules libphp7.0.so. So that's the full path of the PHP module. But actually what you're going to find is all of the modules that are installed by default will be in this same directory. And that's where we're going to put our new module. Okay, so to get out of Nano, it's Control X, and since I have no changes to save, I'm back at the prompt. So I need to move our module file over to the server. I'm going to do that using Winscp. So I'm going to connect up to 192.168.0.9, that's our web server, and I'm going to connect up as the non-administrative user. And on the home directory here, you can see that we're still in the PA server directory, or rather we're still in the home directory, which is home/Craig. We can see our PA server. And I'm on my C drive over on the left. Now, I actually stored my project on my D drive, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to my D drive here, enter into the web broker test directory, go into Linux 64, debug, and here we have libmodtest.so. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that file up over onto the server. So if I now switch to home Craig and do a list, we can see our libmodtest.so is there, and we want to move that into, so I'm going to do a cd usr lib apache2 modules. This is the directory that we need the file to, oh, what did I get wrong there? User lib apache2 modules. I mistyped modules. Okay, so I'm going to do a listing here. We can see that we have quite a lot of modules in this directory already. So in order to move something in here, if I do another list with permissions showing, you can see that almost everything in this directory is owned by root. And in fact, I would need to have root permissions to move something into this directory. So I'm going to go ahead and issue the su instruction and elevate myself to the root user. And now I want to copy the module into this directory. So I'm going to issue cp home Craig, and then it's libmod_test.so, and in this directory I'm going to name it libmod_test.so. So that has now moved the module into this directory for us, and it's right there at the top left, libmod_test.so. Let's list again with permissions, and at the bottom here we can see libmod_test.so, and it has the same permissions more or less as all of the other module files. Okay, so that's our module moved. Now we need to come back into cd etc apache2. So we come back to our configuration, and we're going to come into mods enabled, and we need to create an enabling or a loading file for our module. So I'm going to use Nano again, and I'm going to create a file called, let's see, libmod_test.load. So that's to load our lib module. And we need to issue the instruction load module. We need to give the module a name. Well, I believe it's called lib test module. Actually, I'm going to call this test module. Okay, and I'm going to put in the directory to it, which was user lib apache2 modules, and then libmod_test.so. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that off, and let's see if the Apache server config is correct. We can do that by restarting Apache, so I'm going to do /etc/init.d/apache2 restart. So I'm actually calling the service script for Apache 2 and telling it I want to restart the server. And we have a fail here. So what did we get wrong? Let's go and take a look in the config here. And actually, no, it's because I typoed userlib Apache modules. Okay, let's try that again. And this time our service restarts. Excellent. So we have now installed our module into the Apache server, but we've not given ourselves any way to access that module. So let's go ahead and set up the config for that. I'm going to change directory into etc Apache 2, and I want sites enabled. So we're going to make changes to the 000-default.conf file. And again, I'm going to use nano for this, 000-default.conf. And the change I'm going to make is I'm going to come down to where we have document root here. And I'm going to insert a new section, location. And I'm going to give the location an alias. I'm going to go for XYZ. And then I want to enter the set handler directive. And the handler I'm going to set for this will be libmod_test-handler. So that's the name of the library -handler. And then I'm going to close the location section and exit out of here. And then we'll restart the Apache server. And we'll go and check that in a web browser. 192.168.0.9. That isn't connecting, I think. Yes, my IP address has changed again. I'm now on 17. So I'll go over to 17, and there's our Apache server. And if I put /XYZ, we get our web server application. Okay, so now let's make our Apache module do something a little more interesting. We're going to read some data from a database and return that from our endpoint. So before we do that, I'm going to write a little convenient script here. So I'm going to issue nano deploy.sh, and then I'm going to enter the instructions etc init.d apache2 stop cp home Craig, and obviously use whichever username you entered on setup, libmod_test.so, and move that to usr lib mod apache 2 modules libmod_test.so etc init.d Apache 2 start. So if I press Ctrl X and Y to save that and list, I now have this deploy.sh script. So when I use Winscp to copy new versions of libmod test up to the server, I can run the script with the instruction sudo sh deploy.sh. Issue my password, which should only be asked for the first time in a session, and the Apache server is shut down, the module copied into place, and the Apache server started back up. So there's a convenient little script to help us deploy this module when we come to do so. So now let's create a database. Now when we installed Ubuntu, we included LAMP, so we have MySQL. So I'm going to type MySQL, MySQL, -h for host, and the database is running on localhost. -u for user, well I'm going to log in as root since we don't have any other users at this point. -p for password, and rather than put the password on the command line, I'll allow it to prompt me for that. And I'm now logged into the MySQL database. The first thing we need to do here is to create a schema. So I'm going to do create schema, and let's create test with a semicolon. So we now have a test schema. I'm going to tell the system to use test, and we're logged into that schema. So now we need to create a database table. So the table I'm going to create is create table persons, copying this example from W3 Schools on MySQL. And I'm going to have a field in this called person ID, so that will be our ID field, which is an integer. I'm going to have a last name, which is a varchar 255, a first name, which is also a varchar 255. Let's have an address field, varchar 255, and a city, city, which is varchar 255. I promise I will learn to type one day. Okay. So issue that instruction and we now have a table. So let's insert some data into that table. We'll issue insert into persons, and I want to insert the fields person ID, last name, first name, address, city. And the values for those fields will be, well, the person ID, I'm just going to put person ID number 1. For a first name, I'm going to put in, a last name, Chapman. And for a first name, I'll issue Craig. And for an address, undisclosed. And city, undisclosed. Okay, so now we have some data to insert. There it is. We should be able to do a select star from persons, and there's our record in the database. Now, in order for our module to access this, we need the client libraries to be installed on the Ubuntu system. So if I exit from MySQL, what we want to do here is sudo apt-get install libmysql-dev. I think that's right. Let's check it. Doesn't know it, so let me check what that's supposed to be. Okay, that should have been libmysql client-dev. I'm going to issue yes to install it, and then we wait while the system installs that library. And with the library installed, we're now poised to deploy applications with database access to our Ubuntu server. So let's pull the server out of the way and take a look at our code here. The first thing we want to do is open up the module mod main, and in the source code we're going to add in the units necessary to access the database using FireDAC. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy paste these in. The source code can be found in the subversion which accompanies this session. So we have here the FireDAC standard units and the physical MySQL drivers for FireDAC, as well as, and quite importantly, firedac.consoleui.wait. So if you try to use the wait cursors that you're familiar with for GUI-based FireDAC applications, they're not going to work because there is no GUI. We're running inside an Apache module, so you need this unit included. And with that done, we need to write a function which is going to query the database. Now, I've covered this many times before in blogs and in webinars, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste this code in, and we'll do a quick run through to see what this is doing. So first of all, this is dbQuery as a function that returns a JSON or tJSON value as a return. So we're going to be able to return a piece of JSON which will be spat out of the other end of our server. So we need a connection component, a query component, and I've got a row variable here for the JSON as we build it. And what we're doing is we're putting in the parameters to connect to our test database. And then we're building a query, select star from persons, and looping through each of the results. And for each of the results that we loop through, we create a new row in the JSON, and we add each of the fields as a pair. Now, the one thing that we haven't done on our server yet is create a user which is able to access the test database. So let's go take a quick look on our server again and see how we resolve that. I'm going to use the MySQL instruction again on host localhost user root with a password, and again I'm going to use the test schema, and I'm going to issue the command grant all on test.star, so that's all tables of the test schema, to let's say test, and then we'll put at localhost identified by, and I missed a space there, and then we need to give a password, so I'm just going to put test as the password. Okay, so when I issue that instruction, we now have a user named test with a password of test, which has access to everything in the test schema. Okay, so let's exit out of there, back to our code. Once we've called this function, we're going to need to, or rather once we've written this function, we need to call it to return the result. So we're going to modify our existing code here. I'm going to take out the HTML that we're returning, and instead I'm going to return dbQuery, which is the method call, to JSON, because we have a method to JSON to create a string. Now dbQuery isn't identified yet because our function header is using a JSON to JSON value, and we need to include the system.json unit for that to be recognized. So let's go ahead and build and see if this works. And yes, it's built. So now that it's built, we can deploy it out to our server. And as my server is constantly changing its IP address, I'm going to double check where that's sitting now. So ifconfig, and I'm on IP24. So I'm going to open up my Winscp 192.168.0.24, username Craig, and log in. Okay, so I'm going to browse to the location on my D drive where I now have our Apache module under Linux Boot Camp, Web Broker Test, Linux 64, debug. So here's our libmod test SO, and I'm going to drag that over so it's going up into home Craig. This is the directory we have permission to deposit that file into. And then on the server, I need to issue our sudo sh deploy.sh. Okay, so now that file has been deployed, if we go and browse in our web browser to 192.168.0.24, and then we extend the path with XYZ for our module, we can see a JSON piece of text containing the data: first name Craig, last name Chapman, address undisclosed, and city undisclosed. So we're now able to get data back from our server-side database through our Apache module. Again, my name is Craig Chapman, and thank you for joining us here today.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Craig, so much for that very informative boot camp. A lot of stuff moved real quickly in there, so we'll definitely make sure we have a replay available for everybody. We also have Marco Cantu, our Delphi product manager, on the line with us to answer. Hey, Marco, answer some questions. He has another meeting as a product manager. He's incredibly busy, so I appreciate him taking a few minutes to come out here and answer some questions before he runs off to another meeting to work on releasing the next version of Delphi.
Sure.
So, Marco, what sort of server-side technologies does Delphi for Linux support? DataSnap? What services?
Well, basically all of them. So it's we have like core, operating system operations, database access, as was shown in the previous demos. In terms of servers, technically server side or HTTP servers, we support plain web broker applications. We support DataSnap. And we support RAD server/EMS modules. So all of the technology that we provide for connectivity. Now you can also build your own like standalone in the HTTP servers, or you can also have or just create socket services or UDP servers that don't use TCP/IP or HTTP. So it's Indy is part of the distribution. So you get the ability to create different types of services as well.
Is also the new native sockets that we have, are they also part of it?
In terms of the HTTP client, yes, you can use the HTTP client library to reach additional, you might want to triangulate. You receive a request and you want to talk with another existing server, or you can have a server-side utility that just I don't know, collects data from the internet. Let's suppose you have that scenario and populates a database. So yeah, you can use the REST client library and the HTTP client library to call other services on different systems.
Okay.
Marco, you mentioned there using sockets. Is the socket support included in the POSIX library import?
That's a good question. We don't have direct socket support. The old one we had on Windows it's been long deprecated. So, I mean, you can call the native APIs. I mean, the POSIX APIs are available. They were not in one of the betas. We just forgot distributing some files. But the API is there. So you can call the POSIX API, but you can use Indy, which is a wrapper on top of the operating system APIs. So there are different options, and I'm sure that you'll see third-party libraries and additional options becoming available on the foundation. So I know that some web broker add-on libraries are being worked on and ported to our Linux solution.
Great.
Now, there's some questions about whether or not Delphi IDE will run on Linux, or if you'll be able to build GUI applications with it, or where exactly.
We don't ship client GUI library. Now, that doesn't mean you cannot technically build a user interface, because again, there are APIs, there are libraries. You can call shared objects in general that provide abilities. So it's not that we're preventing anyone from, but there's no VCL, there's no FireMonkey, there's no visual designer as part of the IDE for building Linux apps. The only app that we officially support as part of the IDE is console apps or web apps.
Yeah, and you also support, because a couple of people are asking these questions here, so we also support building shared object libraries, right? So
Absolutely.
So you can build for other web servers if you're dedicated enough to provide the correct exports from those.
Yeah, I mean, we support full integration with Apache, and so yeah, you can build an SO for that. That's what we provide. But yeah, other, I mean, I don't know, I mean, native integrated engine server or whatever. I mean, it's again, it's a pretty core technology, so it can be used. I mean, we support some of the basic features, but you can build a lot on top of it.
It would appear there's some confusion about the release or availability. Now, this was a beta preview.
There is a beta preview available to Update Subscription customers, and if you are an Update Subscription customers and never received an invite, you can ask. You can ping either your sales representative or ping us. It's still under NDA, so you're not supposed to publicly discuss it, but it's available to everyone on a subscription who accepts signing the NDA. And we'll release the product when it's ready. It's close to being ready, but it's not ready. It's not released.
Okay. What about, is it possible to create RPM or deb packages to deploy applications from Delphi?
It should be possible, because it's just a way to package some binary files. We don't have a ready-to-use deployment mechanism like we have for other platforms creating the packages for you. But in terms of being able to do it, yeah, I mean, you should be able to do it.
So if someone has a application where they're currently building a server on Windows, how much effort should be involved in that server migrating to Linux if there's no GUI portion present?
It might depend on the technology. I mean, overall, the code is pretty portable. There are few differences in the fact that we don't support ANSI strings. We support UTF-8 and Unicode, so UTF-16 natively. So if you're using like short strings or ANSI Windows string models, then there will be a little bit of change to do. The other thing that the memory model, the way objects are managed in memory is different because it's arc-based. So in most cases it's transparent, but if you have like your own object library, you might have to fine-tune the memory management. The other area is that if you're using anything that's Windows specific, I don't know, I mean, COM objects, if you're using I mean, ADO, if you're using, I mean, a driver access, I mean, if your database is accessed, then you might have some trouble migrating. But again, if you're using any Windows-specific technology, then it might not be available. But everything else, I mean, like the core, data processing, database access. Again, if you're using FireDuck, if you're using DB Express, that's not available on Linux. It's only FireDuck, or eventually third-party libraries would become available.
So one question that's come up a lot here, Marco, I wanted to interrupt you with. I tried in the IDE, I tried creating a service and adding the Linux target platform, and that's currently not in the beta release.
No, because that's not something we're planning, because a service in Windows is a specific, it's a Windows-ism, I mean, a specific type of Windows application. Now, the concept of a service on Linux is slightly different. It's technically it's not much different than a console application that has specific rights and permissions, and has generally some automatic behavior in terms of, well, I mean, being executed when you start, but that's configuration, or being kicked off regularly with a cron or some other mechanism. So, but technically, I mean, a service is really a Windows service. We might come up with something to simplify creating demos on Linux, but that would be separate from a Windows service.
Okay, and just to sort of add to that, I know that in order to daemonize an executable on Linux, you can call the fork method from the libc. However, this does require redirecting input and output, and I've not yet tested if redirecting the input and output streams is going to upset the Delphi application. So I'll experiment.
Yeah, it's not a feature that was in our original spec, meaning that's something we 100% need to have first release. It might be working. There might be some issues that we need to handle, and we can certainly do that for the future. But it was not in part of our core specs. I mean, not a lot of developers that use Linux for the web services. I mean, they write daemons or low-level services.
Understood.
Okay, so it looks like Marco's about time for him to take off. Any other quick questions we need to have him answer, Craig? I think I went through and picked out most of the ones. I think he's got them all. I guess there was always the big question is, when is it going to be available, released? And usually the answer is when it's done.
Yeah, when it's ready. Again, it's close to being ready, but it's not ready today, so we're not announcing it. But as you've seen, I mean, a lot of things are warning. There's some few bugs that we want to nail out before shipping to provide good quality, and that's also because the product has Linux, but it has a few other features in other areas beside the new Linux compiler. So that's yeah, a little more a little bigger of a product than just a Linux product. I mean, it's not like Kylix that was a separate product. This is folded into a full release of RadStudio.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Marco, for coming out and helping answer questions, and for all the work you're doing to bring this awesome new release to us. So I'm looking forward to it.
No problem. Try my best. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, Craig, now it's just you and me for the rest of the questions.
Great.
Here's one. I guess I could have had Marco answer this one, but I can answer this one. Is what edition will this be available in, Enterprise or Professional? Actually, let me crib here a second first. This is an unreleased product, and we usually are real careful about talking about unreleased products because things do change. That's why we're not giving official release dates or anything like that, even though we do have plans internally. So things do change, and so I'm gonna answer these questions to the best of my knowledge, but I want you all to be aware that things do change between now and release time. So, you know, don't make any plans yet, and know things do change. Hopefully I cribbed enough there. So the question here is, will this be in Enterprise or Professional? So my understanding is that because all of the technologies that it is around, as far as like DataSnap and WebBroker and so on and so forth, are all enterprise technologies, and so the decision was made that it would only be at the enterprise level because it didn't make sense to provide it at the professional level since there would not be any features available. Now, I know that, of course, you can some people do buy professional and then go buy the enterprise features they want from third parties. And so, of course, certainly you can do that, but that's not where we've aligned this product. So hopefully I answered that diplomatically.
So one question that's interesting here, I think we just heard Marco mention that the Linux compiler is using automatic reference counting. And
yes.
I had actually been told differently by other various parties, but I expect Marco to know. In my experience with the ARC compilers, no, it is not possible to turn off ARC. So to answer your question, no, I don't believe it will be possible to turn that off. But I had actually been told differently, that it doesn't support ARC, and I guess that person was incorrect. Marco would know.
It is ARC on the Linux, and Linux is the ARC compiler.
Right.
So,
and yeah, we don't have the ability to turn that off. It's an integrated part of the compiler output. So
now I will say this: I was very skeptical of ARC at first. Someone pointed out, but you've been using it for years with interfaces and strings in Delphi. And I'm like, I want to manage my own memory. Damn it, you know. Oh, I shouldn't have said that on a webinar. But after. And I come from a .NET. I've done .NET development before. Garbage collection is a pain in the keister, and I was like, I don't want to have that uncertainty. But then, as I've come to understand ARC better, I realize ARC's deterministic, whereas garbage collection is not, and you're still in ultimate control of when that memory is released. So ARC isn't as bad as I thought it was.
I'm with you, Jim. When I first started using ARC, in fact, I believe it was you that I messaged on Skype and said, WTF's going on, right? So
yes, I remember that.
I was quite frustrated, and I think it was within a half an hour or so of that message, actually, the penny dropped, and yeah, I now wouldn't write code that wasn't ARC compatible. I'm fully bought in, fully paid up member.
Yeah, I've had a number of MVPs and other people that have been skeptical of ARC now saying, when do we get ARC on Windows? There's a learning curve. Some things will behave differently. Generally speaking, the code is mostly compatible between the two platforms, but I definitely am a big fan of ARC, and I think it's a great improvement to move forward.
Yeah. And just before you move on from that, so the one thing I'd point out with ARC that this was the one thing that got me is we're very familiar in VCL with having an ownership chain for disposing of memory. And that's actually what becomes difficult in ARC, because you have a list of children on one class, and each of those children has a reference back to the parent, where you've now got circular references, and it looks like it's impossible to free the classes because they each reference each other. You stick in a little directive to make one of those links in one direction weak, and that problem goes away. But then from that point on, everything with memory management becomes easier. You just forget about things and let the compiler clean it up. And I understand the argument that I used to put forth that I don't want to be encouraged to not control the memory myself because I think of it as lazy. But actually ARC doesn't do that. You still need to be thinking about where things are freed. You just can trust the compiler to take care of it at the best moment for you. So
there's some questions about GUI support. It's not on our roadmap. It's not planned on this release. It's not on the roadmap for the future release. Roadmaps change, right? I mean, that's just kind of a plan. But I will tell you personally, I suspect we'll see some third parties come up with some really creative ways to create GUIs with the Linux compiler, and that will probably be a great option as to see that. And maybe at some point we will incorporate it into our roadmap. But right now it's not on our roadmap to have GUI support on Linux. As far as other... Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to expound on that. So a lot of the questions that we've been asked today can be answered in the following way. No, our official release doesn't technically support this at this time. However, pretty much everything on Linux is libraries, shared object libraries, the equivalent of a Windows DLL. And so if you wanted to support, for example, the X Windows system, then you import the X window development library, and if the header is not already in the product, a lot of headers are already in the product, but if it's not, then you can import the functions from that library in the same way as you do functions imported from a DLL. It's just a different calling convention. Instead of standard call, it's cdecl. But you can import libraries to do just about anything on Linux. So if it's not supported in the official release, that doesn't mean that you can't do the product. Generally, you can add features in.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. Very important point. And the thing that is interesting is, as a Delphi developer, I will admit Delphi has spoiled me because of how easy it makes things to do. But whenever I have to go down and reach down to the metal and grab those APIs directly, which is something Delphi makes easy to do as compared to other high-level programming languages, at that point, even though it's like, this is so much harder than using a drag-and-drop component, I remind myself that if I wasn't using Delphi, this is the way all my code would be written. So then it's not so much bad.
Yeah, and let's face it, if you do that import one time and you turn that into a component, you've got that component forever going forward. And this is, one of the biggest beauties of Delphi when it was first released is third-party component support. So why not share that code, right? So we are a Delphi community. Let's work together to provide what we're missing, if anything.
So there's questions about third-party components. I can't comment for sure on any of them, third parties. I know a lot of them are working on it, and as such it's unreleased, so I can't commit to whether or not they're going to have it available at the release date for ours or not yet, but they are working on it. Definitely feel free, if you are a big fan of particular component vendors' components, email them and say, oh my goodness, I cannot wait for your support on Linux, and let them know how important that is to you so that they will make sure that they get it done to have it available as soon as possible for you. We're telling them that it's important to our customers, but if you tell them, that's all the more votes they have.
The other question that comes up quite a lot here, so I want to point out that during the video, the executables that I'm producing, you saw the file sizes, they are quite large. That is a debug mode executable with all of the, so we're using the GDB debugger on Linux, with all of the GDB debug information still in the executable. I haven't tried to see how big or small that file is in release mode. I expect it to be significantly smaller when you build a release mode executable. It is still, however, I believe, Jim, you can correct me on this, it is still an LLVM backend, so it's going to be comparable with other LLVM compilers, frankly.
Correct. I believe it's an LLVM as well. The one thing, though, to keep in mind is, yeah, it will be smaller as in release mode, but another thing is that because when you're building an app with Delphi, it's including the RTL in there, that adds an initial bump to the file size. Now you could strip out all the RTL or a lot of the RTL functionality and make your exe your binary a whole lot smaller, but you'd be giving up all that functionality. But what that means, though, is that once you've got over that initial hump of including the RTL libraries in there, that your as you add more functionality, you're going to grow, your binary will grow slower, right? So it's not going to be a if it's like, well, hello world is one line of code and it's size X. When I add 2 lines of code, it's not going to be X times 2. It's going to be X plus just a little bit. And so that's the important differentiation.
I expect this to be something you'll notice less on Linux because the .NET framework, for example, is very common on Windows, but is used a whole lot less on Linux. So in terms of comparing the executable sizes to a language with a runtime deployed, in the .NET case, you'll probably find that the executable sizes are comparable on Linux. Java, of course, being another runtime which is available on Linux, you may notice executables bigger than Java executables because, as you say, they're carrying the runtime library with them. What it does mean, of course, is that you have fewer dependencies, and that's always a good thing in my book.
So there's a question here about distributing a binary that may include Linux open source code. So I actually contacted them, the the GPL Foundation, or I can't remember what it's called actually, but I emailed them and said, hey, if I build something and it links against an open source library, doesn't that make my project open source? So there actually is a clause in there that allows for, if it's linking against something that is distributed as part of the operating system, then no, it does not. So if you build something that runs on Linux that is therefore linking against headers for Linux that is a architecture of GPL, then that is not GPL. Now, if you take a GPL library and incorporate that library into your application and build on it, then your application will become GPL. Okay, so if you grab a third-party component that's GPL licensed and compile it so you're incorporating that functionality in, then it's GPL. But just writing a program that uses an API exposed from GPL does not make your project GPL. That being said, talk to a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. That's just my understanding.
Yeah. So in the world of the Free Pascal compiler, which has been around on Linux for a long time, I've been using that for quite a long time. The way that they tend to deal with it is exactly that. Your code's not GPL just because it consumes an OS API that's GPL. The difference between Delphi and Free Pascal in this case would be most of the Free Pascal headers, so bindings to the OS level stuff, are actually LGPL, so lesser GPL. They still have licensing conditions on them, but they are fewer than the GPL license. You're permitted to use it for linking. Now, the LGPL, to my knowledge, has never been tested, and it's something that I've always been cautious of. Delphi's headers are, of course, proprietary, or rather Embarcadero headers. So that removes you an additional step from the licensing concerns. Not that I'm going to say you're removed entirely. Like you said, talk to a lawyer. So.
Yes, this was a very, very informative, very packed webinar. We will have a replay available, and we're doing our best to go in and answer questions as well. So, Craig, make sure you save the question log when we're done. I can't do that from my end. I'm on the inferior OS.
Honestly, don't know if I have the ability to do that, but I'll check.
You're on Windows, right? You should be able to do it.
Okay.
What about SOAP web server service? That should be supported as well, I believe. I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, well, so DataSnap is supported, and DataSnap relies on the SOAP technologies under the hood, so I expect that those technologies are in, and of course web services are supported, so I don't know why that wouldn't be. I've not tried it, but I think it will work. Frankly, I've been aiming more at REST and JSON than SOAP, just because it's becoming more of a de facto standard these days.
Yeah. So essentially, if you have, like Marco said, if you have something that's server-side, so no GUI, it's not making Windows calls directly, which you may be doing and not realizing. As soon as you try and compile, it will tell you, and you can fix those things quickly, hopefully. And you know, is using FireDAC for your database access. It should be pretty easily to migrate over. The goal is, so ideally we'd love it if you could just say, oh yeah, take my server application, hit add target Linux, build, compile, deploy, run. That would be great. And some people that will happen. The reality is some people are making Windows calls, like I said, and not aware of it, or they are possibly using DataSnap or BDE or whatever, different data access frameworks or something like that, or maybe they have a GUI window they've added for debug purposes or something like that. So you'll have to address those issues, but the end result will be that whatever you do to fix this to run on Linux will then also still be able to run on Windows, right? You're not going to have to give up, shouldn't have to give it significant functionality. You just have to, you know, make a few changes to the way things work. You may be using ANSI strings for some strange behavior or doing some interesting memory management someplace or another, and you might have to address those and fix it. But the end result will be you'll have a project that will compile and run on both Linux and Windows just fine, and can share code across Android and iOS and Mac OS as well, which is just mind-blowingly amazing to be able to do that sort of technology.
And question here, clarifying on the networking stuff, are there any Delphi multi-platform networking API? I believe Indy addresses that. Marco said that Indy supported across Linux. Any plans on integrating RIA technology like Radius or UniGUI in RAD Studio? in order to write apps that run on Linux LAMP. What do you know, Jim?
What is it? One more time?
Any plans to include technologies such as UniGUI?
So I cannot comment for sure if UniGUI is planning to support Linux or not. I know that we've talked to all of our tech partners about supporting it, and I can't comment about whether or not we're going to incorporate anything new feature-wise around that. But definitely, no, that is something we are aware of and we know is important to our customers and are working around. So I can't really answer that question, but it's not that we're ignorant of the requirement, for sure.
I would echo you there in saying it's not something that I can comment, but we are looking at this as a problem and have talked to our tech partners. So
there's some questions about FireDAC. I just put a link to the FireDAC skill sprints. Those are a great place to start if you're new to FireDAC.
Boost networking. Certainly not Boost specifically at this point because support for Linux is in Delphi only, not C++ Builder, and of course Boost is a C++ library. I really think the most comparable thing for networking is still the Indy framework or going. So there's also a third-party library that I've not tried yet. I don't know if it's going to work. It's called Synapse, and it's a wrapper around the socket layer. And it's compatible with both Delphi and FPC, and I know that for FPC it works on Linux, but the bindings to the OS are different in Delphi to FPC, so if it does its own binding, then it will probably be compatible, but otherwise not. So yeah, I mean, most of these questions are things where I have to say, I've not tried it yet. I don't know that there's been official support for trying it or official attempts at trying it yet. We are still pre-release. So.
Okay, wow, we're coming up on a quarter to the hour.
Actually, let me grab you with one last thing here. So a lot of people have asked about distributing VMs which have Linux pre-installed. I certainly couldn't host one myself, but do you know if that's something Embarcadero could do?
So that's something we've talked about, and maybe we can come up with some way of doing that, distributing that. Once release occurs, a VM with PA server already installed that you can download and run. We actually have discussed this a little bit. We'll have to figure out the logistics of distributing that.
I mean, to my mind, that seems like an awfully large download to make for the sake of, you know, once you have an installation disk, it's a few instructions to install a PA server. So it seems like an awfully large download to go and do in place of just downloading the ISO and issuing the PA install.
Yeah, I'll echo that. To be honest, when we were doing the beta, we were like, hey, we got to make this easier for our beta testers to get up and running on Linux. And so Craig made that phenomenal blog post he has on installing all these different platforms. I made one as well. It wasn't near as detailed as Craig was, but once that was all done, I was like, oh, I know, I'll just grab this disk image and distribute it. And I looked at it, and it was huge. I tried compressing it. It was still huge. And I was like, you know what? I've already installed Linux 10 times to to refine my process for my blog post. It's not that hard. So maybe we'll do that, but to be honest, if you follow one of the guides, especially Craig's guide on how to do this, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't take that long, and it's a whole lot smaller download, a whole lot smaller to just download the installation disk for Linux.
And then, of course, as you and I showed this in the session, if you're using virtualization software, back a copy of the image onto like an external disk or something, and you can restore that at any time, and you're back to where you started. You're ready to deploy to Linux again. So.
Are compiled modules, shared libraries, and output programs compatible with ELF format, executable in linkable format? I believe they have to be to run on Linux. I'm familiar with ELF. Yeah. So I believe. Any plans to support SUSE? So as I tried to explain in the beginning, SUSE's in the RPM family, the Red Hat family. It should work with SUSE. So this first release, we're saying it works with Red Hat and Ubuntu. Now, if someone discovers, oh my goodness, it doesn't work with SUSE, and this is hugely important because of X, well, maybe we can add SUSE as a test platform in the future and make sure it works with that one. We're never going to reach compatibility with all Linux platforms. That's just impossible. There's nothing that runs on every Linux platform without some modification. And I've said that, and someone probably will prove me wrong, and that's fine. But the point is that Linux is a hugely diverse platform, and especially binary distribution. Anything that's distributed on Linux that's going to run on every platform is distributed at source and then compiled with GCC for the specific platform. So that's probably a safe statement to make. But yeah, there's nothing that says in the future we won't expand this support to other Linux platforms. But I think the plan of targeting Red Hat and Ubuntu, the two largest players, and from two distinct different families, is going to produce a lot of compatibility. And like I said, I know someone's already tried it on Slackware with pretty good results.
I've heard to issue the corollary, I've heard the opposite on CentOS, somebody trying to deploy and it didn't work with CentOS. Now, that was down to, I believe, version numbering on the library names. And one thing that I'm keen to try is either using older versions of those libraries or just creating symlinks for them and seeing if I can trick the system into thinking they're compatible. But yeah, what you're going to find is some distros it will be compatible with, some it won't. Red Hat and Ubuntu are the supported platforms, and I think that unless there is a strong demand for a particular OS, it's unlikely that they'll be added just for the sake of it, because of course the more Linux platforms we add support for, the more testing is involved before a release. So.
And the role of Linux platforms is that in the time it takes to test something for a Linux platform, two new Linux platforms appear. So you're never going to reach complete coverage.
Yes, I mean, I'm creating my own new Linux platform for myself right now, for just as an academic exercise. So a new one's about to be produced. Yeah.
And I believe you're serious, Craig. That's a serious thing.
It's semi-serious. Yeah.
Are you going to open the IDE so someone can make visual development add-ons for Linux UIs if they want? The IDE is open. The OpenTools API is very, very powerful. So yeah, you know what? I just got an email this morning. There's a project called Cross VCL. I'm not sure if you've seen this or not, where they're making the VCL work on Mac OS X. They just had their 0.2 release. That's a beta, early beta, but I just got an email about it this morning. So that's not something we ever planned to do, but they've figured out a way to do it. I don't know how, but so there's nothing that says that in 2 months after release, someone's going to come up with maybe Cross VCL will say, hey, look, we just made it so you can run VCL on Linux. And people, oh, I don't know. I suspect, I know we have the most creative third-party component vendors and community members in the world, and somebody will come up with something that'll blow us away and be amazing.
I'm really hoping so. So the VCL, the Cross VCL for Mac, my understanding is it runs by rendering into an X server window. Now, that would mean that theoretically that very same project could be ported to Linux relatively easily. They're both POSIX-based systems. Now, when I say relatively, it's still a lot of work. I wouldn't expect it next month. But yeah, it's kind of a watch this space. I'd be very surprised if we don't start to see libraries to solve some of these problems shortly. Running VMware and VirtualBox on the same computer, I don't believe there's any incompatibilities. I've never tried running the two at the very same time, like an instance of a VMware and an instance of a VirtualBox, but I have had both installed on the same machine at the same time, so I don't see any problems there.
Now, there were some questions about, you showed VirtualBox, but there are questions about, what about Parallels? What about VMware? What about Bill and Ted's excellent virtualization platform? It should work on all of them. I use Parallels. I know people who use VMware just fine, no problem. The steps are 99% exactly the same as Craig showed. just insert your favorite virtualization software instead of VirtualBox.
Do I have more info about why Hyper-V can't be used with Oracle Box? Not exactly. I don't want to pretend I fully understand it, but I have had machines failing in the past with various things that typically the equivalent of blue screen errors on Windows, so hardware level exceptions. And when I went off and researched what was causing these problems, it was Hyper-V being turned on. So I turned it off and those problems went away. Now that's not to say that I actually understand what caused that, but you know, I've had these compatibility issues and wanted to sidestep them for this this video. So that's why I turned that off.
And I'm going to kind of echo what we said earlier. There's a lot of, like Craig was saying, CentOS, so earlier report you're saying doesn't work. This is pre-release. It could be released and it could change. And also, there's nothing that says, like Craig was saying, there might be some way of creating some sort of symlink or something that makes it all of a sudden work correctly. So even if something doesn't work right out of the gate, like I said, we have incredibly creative community members and tech partners that will probably come up with a lot of solutions in the short term, shortly after release, for some of these issues as well.
And also remember that so the PA server is the PA server's requirements are Ubuntu and Red Hat. There's nothing to say that your own applications won't run on other targets, and in fact, if you're careful about how you bind to the libraries, then you can probably sidestep incompatibilities. It's just that the only platform that we can, the only platforms we can officially support are those two.
Yeah, each new platform we have to officially support is going to be could potentially be a big deal. Make sure we perform. As far as performance goes, it's hard to talk about performance yet because this is early beta. So a lot will change before release comes around. And some things will be faster on Linux than on Windows. Some things will be faster on Windows than on Linux. So it's hard to really talk about performance-wise, especially because of using LLVM versus R compiler. So R compiler typically builds very fast, whereas the LLVM is frequently optimized more around performance than compile speed, because they're coming from a C background, where we're coming from a Delphi background as far as what our expectations are for compiler performance. Which is interesting. LLVM is very fast to anybody that's used to using a C compiler, C++ compiler.
Yes. I remember the post from Mr. Bauer about how long it was taking to build the code base at his new employer.
So replay will be available soon. If you don't have audio right now and you can't hear me, know that we'll have the replay available soon.
Is ARM, or rather will ARM be supported? Currently, for the next release, it's going to be Intel-only Linux, and it's 64-bit Intel-only for Linux. I know that I've seen experiments in the R&D labs whereby we can deploy sort of ARM-based Raspberry Pi and that kind of thing. And of course, we have ARM support for Android. So from a technical perspective, that's not impossible. But from an officially supported point of view, currently no.
Yeah, I can tell you that, yeah, I've been in meetings with product management and folks here. Everybody here is just as big of a tech geek as you guys are, and they're all very excited about wanting to support Raspberry Pis and whatever. So it's not that, like I said, we're not ignorant of these issues and we'd love to support everything everywhere, but limited resources, limited time, and so we definitely are trying to look for the things that have the biggest business impact for our customers, that will produce the best results for them, and are moving forward in that regard. So in the future, hey, we would love to support Raspberry Pi. When that future will be, hard to say.
A couple more here. Some people may need 32-bit Linux support. Why only 64? And my understanding was that when selecting the Linux platform that we wanted to target, all of these features are centered around the enterprise deployments. So look at the typical data center, and what you've got in there is going to be 64-bit at this point. Basically, 32-bit and 64-bit would be two completely different platforms from a support point of view. Sure, the APIs are the same, but they're separate platforms. So faced with the decision of choosing one, it was going to be the one that would support the most enterprise backend, and that's why we got 64-bit only.
Yeah, some of the research shows that as far as server-side deployment goes, which is our target, it's 99% 64-bit. So very few people are running 32-bit Linux servers, at least of the Ubuntu or Red Hat versions that we're targeting, especially of those. Those are fairly recent. So, yeah, if you were running an older version of Red Hat that was 32-bit only on a server still because you haven't touched it because it's still working, okay, yeah, it's not going to work. But that's the exception, not the rule, really.
I do know that I had, from my own personal experience, so I have a project going right now in which I'm installing a full-blown computer in my car, and I wanted to deploy applications using Delphi, and I thought I was going to be stuck with Windows until I heard about the Linux support coming. But then I had forgotten what processor I'd bought for that project, and I thought it was 32-bit, and I can tell you my heart sank when I thought I'm not going to be able to deploy Linux applications to it. But thankfully, in my case, it was a 64-bit processor. If you're on 32-bit, I get it. I would love to see 32-bit support as well, but not at this time.
Well, and it was like some sort of Atom little tiny low power processor you had, and it was still 64-bit. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is an old Atom. I mean, it's getting more and more difficult to find a 32-bit processor, at least. That's not to say you can't install a 32-bit OS on a 64-bit processor, but why would you?
So Jim wants to know if we're going to support add support for 16-bit Windows.
16-bit Windows 3.1. I think it could be possible. No, I'm kidding. No. And I'm sure you're kidding too, Jim.
Yes, I'm sure he is. So
Ubuntu. Ubuntu is not a tested target. However, my understanding of Ubuntu is that with the correct, you can go from Ubuntu back to a full distribution of Ubuntu just by installing the relevant components and libraries. So in order to support the application on Ubuntu, all you would need to do is install the relevant dependencies. So that's my understanding of that.
So some questions about Docker support. We're looking at stuff like that. I don't know if it's going to be in there or not, but yeah, there's lots of stuff as far as like having a PA server available through one of the package managers or something like that. All this is stuff we're looking at. Maybe we'll see what we can get done. I think we've gotten through. If you have a question that's like incredibly important that you don't feel like we've touched on, please do add it again. I'm not trying to ignore anybody here, but I feel like we've answered most of the questions. Keith says, frankly, I like being spoiled. I do too, Keith. I can't tell you how many times I hear people saying, ooh, Technology X is so amazing. And I'm like, ooh, I should check it out. And I go try it. And I'm like, wait, what about this or this or this? And I'm like, okay, be open-minded, Jim. Be open-minded, and I'll keep playing with it. Pretty soon I'm like, man, there's some nice things about this, but I miss Delphi. And then I'm back using Delphi again. Delphi spoils me, and I like it.
As I said in a tweet recently, I've sampled every language. Delphi is my favorite.
Yes. Yes. And you know what? And I will be honest. There are some things I've used in other languages like, ooh, I wish Delphi did this. But overall, big picture, there's more things in Delphi I wish other languages did than the other way around.
That's an update for me. TIOBE index is no longer at 10 on the TIOBE. It's now at 9.
Wow. Oh, fantastic.
Let's keep that going.
Yeah, it's I would love for Delphi to be #1. Realistically, I know that it's probably not going to happen this year, but hey, maybe. I don't know. I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist.
Yeah.
I would love to see it keep going up, and I suspect it will because it definitely is rising in popularity. I talk to more and more people that are coming back to Delphi, doing more stuff with Delphi, etc. So,
Yes, cast off those curly braces.
Rise up, people of Delphi, cast off your curly braces. Oh, and if you haven't noticed, we have added a ton more MVPs, and I'm adding more MVPs. I just had an email yesterday with somebody, Linux developer that is really excited about Delphi for Linux, possibly become an MVP as well. So, you know, if you know of people that should be MVPs that aren't MVPs, encourage them to send me an email, or you can send me an email nominating them. If I don't get back to you, it doesn't mean I don't want to do them. Sometimes I miss things. Feel free to follow up with me. It won't hurt my feelings. But yeah, there are lots of new MVPs, lots of excitement in the community for right now, for sure. And I was just talking to one of our beta testers, and he was, I tell you, ecstatic with the quality of the beta as far as bug fixes and stuff like that. So that's always good to hear that the quality continues to get better, which is definitely an important thing as well. Okay. Oh, how's is Indy now? Okay, so Indy, that's actually a really good question about Indy compatibility from version to version. So I remember that a while. Every now and then Indy would come out with a new version, and it's like, oh, we're completely not compatible with the old version. You got to change all this stuff, and it was a major pain in the keister. Right now, Indy is considered a mature product, and we're maintaining it for compatibility purposes. It's a key part of our technology, and so it's being maintained by our R&D team. It's no longer maintained as an open source project. Well, I guess it is still an open source project, and it will still continue to be an open source project, any code we add to it. But we're not planning to, you know, release a whole new version with breaking changes in the code. That's not on the roadmap. There may be a fork of the open source version that does that, but that's not something we have any plans on doing or incorporating in, because we want to definitely make sure code compatibility moves forward. That's something we've always been very much focused on, is protecting your investment in your code. And I know sometimes there are some things that are painful, whether it be, you know, Unicode support or you know, moving from non-ARC to ARC, and those can be a little painful, but we definitely do put a lot of consideration and thought into that, and when do things need to be changed that have to be changed, and make it as easy as possible for you. So we're not planning on incorporating any huge breaking changes into Indy.
All right. Are you aware of any, the question regarding an XML parser, are you aware of any XML parsers that are open source and don't depend on a platform-specific lib?
XDOM, I believe, isn't it?
So you are aware of one? I'm not myself.
I think XDOM is what it's called. Because we use the Linux. There's two Delphi parsers on Linux, non-parsers. Delphi parsers, MS, XML, and I think it's called XDOM.
I'm looking at a GitHub page for XDOM, but I'm not able to confirm.
Okay, OXML, is that it? Maybe that's what it is. I can't remember what it's called. I think maybe it's OXML. But there are, if my memory serves, and it's been a little while since I've looked at it because I've been doing a lot of JSON lately, but there are 3 XML parsers that are supported on Windows, XML DOM parsers, one of which is MSXML, which is a really nice one on Windows. I really like that one. But the other 2 are open source and are not platform specific. They work on other platforms. And I remember we added one specifically to add support on Android for XML parsing that has really good Android support, if I remember correctly. So I would assume that one also works on Linux. So I believe there is one that works on Linux. And again, you know, pre-release software, going off of my memory right now, I can't find the web page on it. but it should be available. Yes, very excited about Linux support. This is all exciting. I think it's OXML is the one I'm thinking of. Sorry, my allergies have bothered me this morning. Delphi is my favorite pacifier. Yes, Peter. I agree. There's so many things. It's just like I need to do this little thing that it's not really a programming task, but just some sort of task I need to do in my life that Delphi makes so easy to just pull it out and I'm done, you know. And it's one of those, you know, apps that I've got 80% of the functionality done in 5 minutes, but of course that last 20% is going to take, you know, a week or two to get done. But as far as, you know, meeting my need of getting something done. Okay, I think we're done, Craig, unless there's anything I missed that you want to add real quick.
I think we covered everything. If anyone's got any questions, get them in there quickly, because I think we're done.
Otherwise, Craig's email address is on the screen. You can email him. Craig is a Linux expert. I've learned a lot from him.
Thanks for that, Jim.
Yeah. So if you have any problems with Linux at any point ever, just email Craig. No, I'm just kidding. Craig's a good guy, and he will do his best to help you, but he is busy as well, which is why I really appreciate him putting together this fantastic Linux boot camp for us. So.
No trouble. Just so, not a Linux expert. I've been using Linux for a long time, by far not a Linux expert, but go ahead and email me any questions. If I can't answer them, I'll try to find a man who can. And also don't forget about our community site, because you know, despite the number of unanswered questions there right now, we are answering them as quickly as possible. And what you'll tend to find is questions that are clearly written tend to get answered quicker. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep, there is an art to asking good questions, for sure. And I was going to say that as well. Especially if it's probably best if you could ask a question on community and then email Craig, if that makes sense, and say, yeah, with the link, and then he can go answer it on community, and that way the next person that comes along can read that answer on community instead of emailing Craig again.
Good point. And yeah, but the community is probably the best place to go with questions, because it just means that we can keep everybody up to speed. And of course, the small number of us within Embarcadero that can answer questions cannot always answer all of them, but you may find that another community member can. So.
I just saw a message here. Farshad says that Linux support for Unigui is on their roadmap, and it is spelled fantastic because I was too excited. Fantastic. Yay! That's great news.
I would like to ask more on that. Is Farshad, are you a member of the Unigui team by any chance? And if so, will my Unigui that I've already paid for support Linux?
He says yes.
Yes, is on the team. So excellent product, love it. Recently purchased, and I saw that in the source that I was given with my purchase, there is a project set for Tokyo, but is not yet building, and I'm hoping that means that I'll get the Linux support without having to repurchase. So.
Yes. Oh, Farsha, we need to get together and do a webinar on Unigui. So follow up with Craig or myself, and we'll definitely need to do that, because Unigui is fantastic and more people need to know about it. I was at I did a webinar recently on web front ends, and I didn't do justice to it. I tried to cover too many of them, but didn't do justice to them. But I would love to do one specifically around Unigui, because it is such an amazing platform. And I talked to certain people that just love Unigui, and they're like, can't do anything if it doesn't, if Unigui is not there, they're not going to use it. So the more we can tell people about Unigui, the better.
So I recently, say recently, everything's recently with me, but yeah, I was looking for something, because years and years ago I'd used IntraWeb, which is a similar-ish kind of concept, but there were significant issues for me with that product. And so I had started mapping the DOM. I built my own DOM library so that I can spit out HTML without fear of error. And that was aimed to building a framework that I could use for web applications, and then I found out about Unigui. So that made all of my development needs on that project go away, because Unigui is going to take care of it.
Yeah, I believe Intraweb's also working on Linux support. I can't comment for sure on that, but Intraweb's also a great technology, and they got lots of new features as well. But Unigui is different than Intraweb. I like both of them for different reasons. So,
Yes.
okay. Bruce just commented that OmniXML and ADOM are compatible, are cross-platform. So,
Will there be non-visual graphics manipulation support, so T-graphic, T-bitmap? So I'm assuming the question pertains to graphical support that doesn't depend on the Windows API, which currently the VCL graphics classes do depend on Windows and therefore unfortunately won't be available. I know that there are some third-party libraries that don't depend on Windows API calls, and so they ought to work with recompilation, but that's your mileage may vary on that. Marco has said that it is possible that support will be added in the future, but at this moment in time it's not due for the release, so it's not scheduled. Another question regarding CodeSite. Will CodeSite work to transmit log data? And this is going to be a question that now needs to be forwarded back to Ray Konopka. So Ray actually purchased the rights to CodeSite back from Embarcadero, and the product is now managed and maintained by him. I imagine that it's certainly possible. I mean, I don't think anything in Ray's code is platform specific, but I can't really speculate as to if and when he'll do that. And which DBMS will be supported? So effectively the database engines that will be supported are all of those supported by FireDAC, except of course those engines that are Windows only, so or platform specific, I should say. So that's the three questions I was able to forward. The other question regarding cloud support, Amazon, Google, Microsoft's clouds. So the support is as the support is currently. You can deploy to running Windows instances, and you can deploy to instances running one of the supported Linux flavors. As for accessing APIs on their cloud platforms, that's going to be down to the API access technology. Probably most of them, I think, use REST APIs, so you could probably access them that way, but we won't be adding new features for support into the product with this next release at least.
we do have our cloud API support already that is in there. So
yeah, so we have several of these cloud components are available. They are built into the product, but the question was, will we be extending that? And no, not for this one.
No, not being extended. Yep, you're correct. Sorry, I am scanning questions while you talk. So
no problem. FireDAC support. By the way, that answer really goes to heads towards the DynamoDB support. I've never used Dynamo. My assumption is, and I may be wrong on this, that it's a REST API, so you could certainly access it if that's the case, but there's no plans to include support for it for this coming release.
I hear DynamoDB is dynamite.
Right.
All right.
Isn't DynamoDB? I actually know nothing about it. I'm completely guessing, but isn't it really just forwarding MySQL behind the scenes?
Probably. I don't know anything about it either. I'm just
these cloud services tend to forward an existing database and call it something new. So, okay, FireDAC support, yes. DB Express support. Do you know anything about DB Express support, Jim?
No DB Express support. It's only going to be FireDAC is the only component or database access framework that's going to be supported on Linux. In my opinion, it's the only database access framework you need, but I know there are. It is fantastic, but there are some cases when you want to other ones, especially if you have existing DBX components. So I understand that. But FireDAC only, and it's going to support all the databases that aren't Windows specific, namely Access and Microsoft SQL Server. Yes, I know there are ways to access them from Linux, but they are not being currently supported right now.
And GUI support. So no GUI support for this first release. That's not to say, never say never. That's not to say that it won't get added in. And as with all of these features that are not going to be supported in the release, it really comes down to demand. If we see a demand for it, then there is justification for the R&D investment and the QA investment. So never say never, but no, not in the next release. Now, to add to that, and in with the question regarding graphic support, actually, one of the nice things on Linux, you can bind to the libs that are already on the operating system. So you can make use of any existing shared object libraries. You may or may not need to find or provide a header for those libs, but it is very similar to importing a DLL on Windows. So it can be non-trivial if there are a lot of functions in the header, but it is not a difficult challenge exactly. It's just a time-consuming one. The other thing that I found quite a common thing on the Linux platform is to actually consider the command line executables as part of the API. So you can execute an external exe, an external binary, and pipe the output of that back into your application. And doing that, you gain access to all of the power of the command line instructions as well. So, for example, I know that PHP on the back end uses the gdlib for image manipulation. Might be possible to do something working with that. So those are some options, but official support, not yet.
Sriram, just who's our interbase architect, just said that he believes IBX will also be available for Linux 64. So interbase should also have this access. So I guess we should have added our hedging at the beginning that this is pre-release. There's a lot of features coming and going. It's very much in flux. Things change. We're definitely entering this at the best of our knowledge right now, and things change like that. We just found out that from Sriram that apparently IBX is planned for Linux 64. So yeah, things change. So be aware of that, and know that if things we say, don't plan your business around that, because if it doesn't happen the way we are saying it will, that could be bad for you. So be flexible in that, in your understanding of what's going to happen.
And I also expect, as is usually the case with the Delphi community, it doesn't take long for people to find solutions to these problems and share them. So watch for the third-party space as well.
Okay, so Sriram just amended what he said to say that it may be that it is an update to 10.2. So it may be in the it may not be in the 10.2.0 release, but it might be in the 10.2.1 release or the 10.2.2 release. So it is coming, but it may not be in the initial release of 10.2.
Okay, and one question here, attempting to download the beta, but not able to get the link, is not working. I'm going to say the best way to solve that is give us a call, give your rep a call, or send me an email. I can forward it on to the reps. It may be that you need to be added to the beta program, or it may be that occasionally the site does go down. So drop me an email and I'll see what I can do with that.
Yeah, if you're on update subscription and you're not currently invited to the beta, you can send Craig an email or talk to your sales rep. It is a great way, and they can help make sure that you get on the beta. So questions about a Raspberry Pi. So Raspberry Pi is ARM Linux. It's not 64-bit x86 Linux. This is not planned to support ARM Linux. I know that the product managers and the R&D and the architects all are excited about Raspberry Pis and all would love to see it on those yet, but it has not yet been released on that platform, or is not planned to release on that platform in the immediate future. But it's anything's possible, right? So it's not on our roadmap, but it is something we're definitely all very keen to see done. So Jeremy's reporting that he used the beta, and again, this is beta, so this may change, but he built a beta, or built an app using against Ubuntu, PA server running on Ubuntu, and then took the compiled app from Ubuntu to CentOS, and it worked on there. So,
yeah. So the reports that I've had with CentOS are, I've had reports that it doesn't work, and I believe those are down to the installation of the PA server specifically. And I think that what's happening from the report I had was the PA server is looking for dependency libs, which are named as version 5, but on CentOS they're named as version 6. So technically there's not actually any incompatibility there, it's a version numbering. Now, will that get fixed for release? Not necessarily. We're not actually targeting CentOS as a target platform, but should we update the code for Red Hat in the meanwhile, then we may have more mileage with that. Now, when it comes to your actual applications, the same is effectively true in that your application's dependencies must be met. But if they are met, then the executable will run. And so if you manage your dependencies when you're building your application, you'll get more mileage out of the other flavors. But officially supported Red Hat Enterprise and Ubuntu 16.04 or higher.
So it's interesting. Some people are reporting that that free Linux guide URL doesn't work, but I've tried it multiple times. It always seems to work for me, so I'm not sure why. If not, Craig has put the full link in there instead of the short link in the chat window and in the answer questions.
The full link's also on my blog if you miss it. So.
So there is a question here at the very beginning. Otherwise, I think we're about done with the questions about what editions this will be in. Because at first I was thinking, oh, we should put it in every edition. But then thinking about it, realized that it's all focused around the server-side technologies, DataSnap, Web Broker, etc., which are all enterprise-exclusive features. And so from that point of view, it makes sense that Linux is a enterprise-specific feature. Now, in the future, that might change. We might add pro-specific features to Linux support, and then it might make sense to put it in Pro. But for right now, it is planned. Again, it hasn't been released yet, but it's planned to be an enterprise-specific feature because it's really all about the enterprise functionality. Now, that being said, I'm well aware of the fact that you can buy Pro and then go buy a third-party multi-tier or database access framework and get your own enterprise light edition, if you will, but that's really not, doesn't align with our model of the way we're selling it. So that's why we're doing it, saying it's for enterprise. As far as difference in performance, it's really hard to say that because it's in beta right now and things will change between now and then. The goal is, and my expectation is that there should be similar performance between the two. Keep in mind that it is an LLVM compiler, so it's slightly slower, although you saw in Craig's demos, it was very, very fast LLVM compilation. My expectation is there will be some things that will be faster on Windows and some things that will be faster on Linux, but generally speaking, they should be of similar performance.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that you are still producing binaries, so native Intel code running on the Linux console. So you're not running in a VM, you're not compiling as an upfront head cost. So the performance should be comparable with a similar spec Windows machine.
So there's a question here about will it support IntraWeb? As soon as IntraWeb has a release that supports Linux, it will. I believe the IntraWeb team is working on supporting Linux. We had someone from Unigui on earlier this morning, and they said they were definitely planning to support Linux. I'm actually going to send out an email to all the tech partners today, letting them know that we would love it if they started announcing that they had plans to support Linux or not. So do check and then also email any third parties that you're using, any of our tech partners, and say, hey, Linux support is important to me, and let them know that you want to see that. And I'll give them permission that they can start talking about that their planned Linux support is coming. So I know Craig's been using Unigui quite a bit lately and is really excited about getting Linux support on there, which I know a lot of people are. Can we expect additional samples in the release to build rich web servers, sending files, implementation of REST server? You know what? Maybe we can do a webinar around that, Craig, about how to send files and more complex stuff. Get beyond just the basics of building endpoints and stuff, and show how to send files and stuff like that. That could be interesting.
Absolutely, and in fact, so Web broker, I think web broker is possibly one of the most misunderstood technologies. So web broker is a great lightweight framework around HTTP, and HTTP does give you support for sending post data and doing anything you can do with a web server, right? So multi-part post data and all that stuff. So if you wanted to upload files, that would be a great way to go through a web broker action.
Okay, my dog was just complaining that she needed to go out, so I had my son take her. So that was her barking earlier, by the way, during the webinar. I did not have mute on yet. I apologize. And she was letting me know the UPS guy was here, which is very thoughtful of her. She's thoughtful that way. Thank you, Peter. Woof. Can we work with Windows 10 Home or do we Professional Edition to build Apex packages? I believe that'll work with Home. I don't think they have to be a Professional Edition feature. I don't really know. That's not part of we're kind of focusing on Linux right now, but I don't know for sure. It should work on Home just fine, I suspect. Fantastic. It's great to see so many people on here so excited about Linux support. We are really excited about this too. I've talked to a number of our tech partners who are very excited about it as well. Got some good feedback from a number of people. Like I said, it's still beta, so some things aren't working. Hopefully we'll have working by release, and then things are most likely going to change. But anyway, we're very excited about it. And
$1 million question, when will we have Delphi Tokyo?
As soon as it's done.
Yeah. So
shortly after, actually, we have to. Once it's done, we test it and then go through the process of releasing it. But yeah. So subscription update makes it possible for us to do this and have more focus on fixing the smaller things. So if you're not on an update subscription, get an update subscription. Get ready. Get on an update subscription that gives you updates for a year. I think I'm pretty safe in saying it will come out within the next year. And you'll get Linux support as soon as it's available. So that is definitely the way to go. Get on a subscription, get ready for it, and you will be pleasantly surprised.
And not only that, but you'll get access to the beta, which gives you a feature now.
Yes, get the beta. Yes, Stephen, it's a very cruel world. You can't have it today. All right, fantastic, Craig. Thank you so much. I think we're going to call it a stop here. This has been great webinar. Appreciate all the work you put into putting this together and for all the stuff you have on your blog on the installation guides and stuff like that. Definitely encourage everybody to take out a look at those links Craig's provided and peruse through his blog and his installation guide. To be honest, I am frequently going back to your blog because I know that the command I need is right there, and then it's like, oh, there it is, and then I can go back to what I'm doing because there's a few things I still forget occasionally. So,
you know, you're welcome to copy paste it, Jim.
All right. Great. So thank you so much, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you online at future events. We're planning our next quarter's worth of webinars, which will have some more content around Linux and that, but we want to get this one in here just kind of as a sneak peek so you guys can get your Linux skills brushed up, especially if you're on the beta so that you're able to take advantage of the beta, but if you're not on the beta so that you will be ready for the release when it comes out. All right. Looking forward to seeing all the great Linux projects you guys put together, and with that, let's call it at the end of the webinar. Thank you so much, Craig.
Thanks, Jim.